Hello, and welcome back to the Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark Seven, and today I'm pleased to bring you the next part of my series on the Brewster Buffalo, in which we'll take a look at how the Buffalo squadrons of the Commonwealth powers in the Malay Peninsula fared in the initial phase of the Japanese invasion there. As always, the sources used to make this video can be found in the video's description. So, with no further delay, let's continue. As the probability of war became larger and larger, Air Marshal Robert Brooke Popham, the Commander-in-Chief of Far East Command, and his staff formulated a plan, codenamed Matador, in response to the likely threats to Malaya from the Japanese. This plan was intended to go into execution before an invasion was underway, preempt what was thought to be the most probable Japanese strategy. Once the intent to invade was obvious, Allied land forces were to cross the border into Siam and seize Singora and Patani, where port facilities and airfields were to be occupied, to keep them out of the invaders' hands, and to enable a defense of the border as far forward as was strategically sound. This plan was approved by the War Cabinet, but with the strict prohibition on executing any action without the Cabinet's explicit approval. This caution was motivated not by any scruples over the violation of Siamese sovereignty, but to a fear that doing so would provoke a Japanese countermove and saddle the British with the responsibility for the war. To support the planned move and to conduct the aerial defense of the northern border, a force of 76 planes was assigned to the northern airfields. These were under the command of 223 Group, which was renamed Nor Group in mid-October. Furthest forward of these airfields was Kota Bharu on the east coast, one of three in the Kelantan province, the others being Gong Kedah and Machang. A detached flight of 3 Buffaloes from 243 Squadron RAF shared Kota Bharu with the Lockheed Hudsons of 1 Squadron RAAF. Another collection of airfields was situated on the west coast along the main trunk road running south from the border. The most forward of these was Alor Star, hosting 62 Squadron RAF with a dozen Blenheims, not much further from the border than was Kota Bharu. Southwards down the road, opposite the island of Penang, was Sungai Petani, where the bulk of Nor Group's fighters were based. 2 squadrons flew from here, 21 Squadron RAAF with 12 Buffaloes, and 27 Squadron RAF, a night fighter outfit flying Blenheim 1Fs. The rest of Nor Group's bomber force was made up of 6 Wildebeests from 36 Squadron RAF stationed at Gong Kedah, 8 Squadron RAAF and 60 Squadron RAF at Kuantan, operating a dozen Hudsons and 8 more Blenheims respectively. The latter field was on the east coast near the junction of Pahang and Terengganu provinces, about halfway between Singapore and the northern border. Not far south of Sungai Petani was Butterworth, an important support and fallback airfield, with another airfield and facilities further southwards along the road at Ipoh. In addition, a few civilian airfields such as those on Penang Island itself were made use of, notably by the commandeered civilian aircraft used by the MVAF for its supply and communications activities. The rest of the Allied aircraft in Malaya were under the command of 224 Group at Singapore. Here the bulk of the Buffalo force was stationed, 253 Squadron RAAF, 488 Squadron RNZAF, and the rest of 243 Squadron RAF. Along with the fighters, Singapore hosted the remaining Blenheims and Wildebeests, as well as the Catalinas. The latter would be joined by 3 Dutch Catalinas at the end of November. At the same time that the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were arriving in Singapore, that is on December 2nd, the flagship of the Japanese Combined Fleet transmitted the message Nitakiyama Nobore 1208, meaning climb Mount Nitaki on December 8th. This was the signal to begin hostilities against the United States and the British and Dutch empires on December 8th, or December 7th on the eastern side of the international dateline. 2 days later, Vice Admiral Ozawa, flying his flag in the heavy cruiser Chokai, led a convoy of transports and warships south from Samar Harbor on Hainan Island. This was the Southern Expeditionary Force, carrying 20,000 men of the 25th Army under General Yamashita, tasked with the subjugation of Siam, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. It was a fine day with clear weather, and with high morale aboard, the ship steered a course towards Bangkok, hoping to convince any interested observers that this was their destination. In fact, they were headed towards a position in the Gulf of Siam designated Point G. Steaming in radio silence at 16 knots, the fleet encountered a Norwegian steamer and sent a destroyer to stop her. The Norwegian was ordered to steer east out of the convoy's way until it passed, and was only let go after her radio was disabled. On the 6th, though, A much greater threat to Japanese operational security appeared in the form of a Hudson No. 1 Squadron RAAF, which found the convoy some 300 miles off the Malayan coast and reported it to Air HQ. A Catalina flying boat from Singapore was sent to keep contact, but arrived in the area after nightfall and failed to find the ships in the darkness. Second Catalina went searching for them in the morning of the 7th, and was spotted by a Japanese reconnaissance float plane before it could sight the convoy. This float plane, piloted by Naval Aviator 2nd Lieutenant Ogata, moved to intercept the Catalina, and positioned his aircraft just underneath and behind it. Just before 1000 hours, he opened fire, beginning the first air combat of the Pacific War, as well as the first ever exchange of fire between Japanese and British forces. Ogata succeeded in luring the Catalina away from the ships, and a short time later more Japanese planes arrived and shot down the British plane, which was unable to get a report back to Singapore. Thus Ozawa's convoy made it to Point G unobserved. Here his ships dispersed into 5 separate elements, and headed for their targets along the Siamese and Malay coasts. 4 of the 5 were directed against Siamese targets, most importantly Singora and Patani, where the main contingent of their troops would land. The 5th, with 3 transports escorted by the cruiser Sendai and the 19th Destroyer Flotilla, headed for Kota Bharu, carried the 56th Regiment of the 18th Division, seasoned in battle against the Chinese and led by Major General Takumi. This formation, known as Takumi Force for purposes of this operation, was tasked with taking Kota Bharu and then the other airfields in the Kelantan province. In addition to the infantry, Takumi Force included a battery of mountain artillery, as well as small-scale support units such as engineer, medical, transport, and signals troops. Despite a couple further encounters with British reconnaissance bombers, one of which was fired on by Japanese warships, and despite having the War Cabinet's permission, given 2 days before, to execute Operation Matador at discretion, the British command awaited an unambiguous sign that the Japanese were headed for Malaya before sending the Indian 11th Division, held at readiness, into Siam. Hampered by bad weather, Japanese deception and miscommunications amongst their own people, they were unable to obtain a sufficient degree of confidence that the Japanese were indeed coming for them till it was too late to keep Singora and Patani out of their hands. In this way, the Japanese managed to obtain strategic surprise and seize the initiative before the fighting began. They would retain it throughout the campaign. And so, in the pre-dawn hours of December 8, 1941, under cover of thick cloud extending almost down to the sea level, this group of ships approached the east coast beaches at Kota Bharu. Arriving offshore in the darkness shortly after 100 hours, the lead echelon of the force aboard, totaling more than 5,600 men, began to disembark into landing craft. The commencement of the invasion was to be no sooner than 0130 hours, timed to be simultaneous with the attack on the American fleet base at Pearl Harbor. By 200 hours, the first wave was away, approaching the shore in silence, until some of the defending infantry spotted some of them approaching the mouth of the Kemasin River, just north of Kota Bharu, and opened fire. Soon the escorting warships followed suit, shells began to rain down on the beach defenses. The invasion of Malaya had begun. Due to delays in the Pearl Harbor attack, landings here preceded it by a short while, making this the first major action by the Japanese against the Allies. Their objective was the airfield rather than the town, and since this was very close to the landing beaches, the situation was critical right from the beginning. The airfield's commanding officer, on receiving reports of Japanese troops ashore, sent 1 Squadron RAAF into the attack, ordering all available Hudsons to hit the transports standing offshore, as well as the landing craft in the beaches. The twin-engine bombers rode off into the attack, taking off at intervals of a few minutes and making independent, low-level bombing and strafing attacks. One of the planes was downed by the ship's anti-aircraft fire, but the bombers still pressed their attacks and reported hits on the transports. On landing, the bombers were rearmed and took off to make a second round of strikes, losing another of their number. A pause was then ordered to assess the results of the attacks and the situation at large. 17 sorties had been flown against the landings by dawn, and hits were claimed on all 3 transports, 2 of which were burning, and 1 was believed to be sinking. The claims were accurate, as the Japanese transports had suffered heavily. The Sakura Maru took 2 hits. The other 2, the 10,000-ton sister ships Awaji-san Maru and Ayato-san Maru, each received 3 bomb hits and took heavy damage, with about 70 men killed aboard all 3 ships. The Awaji-san Maru, considered one of the most advanced freighters of the pre-war years, was set on fire by the bombers and abandoned. It was set adrift and then sunk by torpedoes from the nearby Dutch submarine K-12. This was the first Japanese ship lost in the Pacific War. A Japanese officer aboard, Colonel Tsuji of the 25th Army HQ, wrote this about the action, quote, "The officers and men of the anti-aircraft detachment, although scorched by the flames, finally did shoot down 7 enemy planes. As the fires burst through the decks of the ships, the soldiers still on board, holding their rifles, jumped over the side. Kept afloat by their life jackets, with which they had been equipped, some managed with difficulty to get into the boats, while others swam towards the shore. For these men, it was a grim introduction to war." It was also an indication of what could have been achieved with a more powerful air force, for even this handful of raids greatly disrupted the Japanese disembarkation and hindered the landings. Operating without air cover of their own, Japanese would have been hard-pressed to put their men ashore at Kota Bharu against an air force much larger than the one they encountered. As it was, though, the raids could inflict pain, but not stop the landings. The beaches were mined and defended by barbed wire entanglements and pillboxes, crisscrossed by small streams and backed by thickets of palm trees, and the sand in places had been piled into high banks by the prevailing monsoon winds. The defenses were manned by Brigadier General B.W. Keyes' 8th Brigade of the 9th Indian Division, supported by elements of the 22nd Brigade and a regiment of the Field Artillery, as well as units of the Indian Mountain Artillery. Fighting on the beaches was vicious and at close quarters, with heavy casualties taken by the first and second wave of invaders. Heavy fighting would continue here throughout the morning, as the Japanese slowly made their way through the mines and the barbed wire. Flight operations at the airfield, only a short distance away, nonetheless continued. Along with the Hudson bombers, the detachment of 243 Squadron RAF was also there as part of Nor Group. Problems with the Buffalo's armament hampered its effectiveness on their first combat mission. This was a pre-dawn strafing attack by 243 Squadron planes against the Kelantan River, where Japanese landing craft were reported to be towing barges upstream towards Kota Bharu town. This kind of amphibious flanking movement using waterways leading inland to get behind beach defenses had been used before in China, and the Japanese army had even constructed specialized amphibious fire support craft to execute these attacks. The 2 fighters then available at the airfield, flown by Flying Officer Holder and Pilot Officer Shield, took off in darkness at 0630 and hit the craft in the river as well as strafing the beaches, with unknown results. Holder's plane was hit by small arms fire, but successfully made it back to the airstrip and landed, only to collide with a damaged Hudson that was obstructing the runway. Shield, meanwhile, encountered a group of 9 Ki-21 twin-engine bombers, most likely from the 62nd Sentai, between the airfield and Machang. He went after them alone and describes what happened in these words, quote, "While at 9,000 feet in pursuit of 9 enemy bombers, I observed a bomb burst approximately 3 miles ahead, and turning sharply to port, I saw a Japanese aircraft at 2,000 feet below. I overhauled the enemy, but as my windshield was covered in oil, I was able to get only occasional glimpses of him. At 350 yards, or as near as I could judge in the circumstances, I opened fire. After one burst, 3 of my guns stopped. The remaining guns stopped after 2 further short bursts. I was unable to see whether the enemy returned my fire. Breaking away downwards, I returned to base. The problems with the guns meant that the Brewster pilots could find themselves suddenly unarmed every time they fired their weapons. Against bombers, this meant missed opportunities like the one just recounted. But against fighters, this very likely meant death and destruction. Another issue often encountered is mentioned in this quote as well. The Buffalo Cyclone engines had a tendency to run hot in the tropical climate, and if this happened, oil seals could burst, which sprayed oil into the slipstream and coated the windscreen. However, I am unsure if this was a problem specific to the Buffalo. Meanwhile, as daylight returned, the Hudsons and Blenheims of Nor Group were back in action against the invasion beaches and transports offshore. They were joined by the wildebeest flying from Gongkeda. These slower biplanes headed out to sea to engage the transports, but these were already withdrawing out to sea, where the deteriorating weather could cover them, and the wildebeest could not catch them, so instead they made torpedo attacks against a Japanese warship that they described as a light cruiser, most likely the Sendai, but possibly one of the destroyers, but without achieving a hit. They flew back, passing over the positions of the 5th Regiment of the Royal Artillery, one of whose gunners, H.W. Barry, described the scene, quote, "Suddenly a shout went up, 'Take cover, here they come.' The faint hum of approaching aircraft grew louder, and presently we saw them. There were 5, and they confirmed our impression of the Jap Air Force. They were all single-cockpit biplanes, but as they passed right overhead, we gave gasps of astonishment. They weren't Japs. They had a circular red, white, and blue on their wingtips. Somebody suggested that they were our training planes, getting away while the getting was good, and it seemed the only reasonable explanation. Our confidence was again shattered when, a few minutes later, we saw a squadron of low-wing monoplanes approaching from the north. We stood out in the open and cheered, but then rushed for cover when they started dive-bombing and machine-gunning the airdrome. This time it was the Japs. Before we went into action that night, we saw most of the hangars on fire, and all the aircraft on the ground destroyed. Our air arm had ceased to function. This assessment was inaccurate at that early hour, but as the morning continued, it would prove prescient. By mid-morning, the fighter base at Sungai Petani had been hit in 2 separate air raids, gutting most of the installation and rendering the airfield temporarily unusable. First came at about the same time the pair of Buffaloes at Kota Bharu were carrying out their strafing attack. At 06:45, Sungai Petani was warned by Kota Bharu that unidentified planes were headed in their direction. 2 sections of Buffaloes were put on immediate readiness to intercept the raiders, with pilots strapped in. 10 minutes later, 5 Ki-21s of the 98th Sentai were spotted coming in at about 11,000 feet, or about 3,350 meters. But the alert fighters were told to stay put. Meanwhile, the rest of the squadron's pilots rushed to get into their planes, but it was too late, and the bombs were already falling. They were forced to take cover. 2 got airborne nonetheless, taking off through the hail of bursting bombs, and chased down the bombers, only for both to suffer weapons failure. 2 Buffaloes were destroyed on the ground by the raiders, along with 2 Blenheim night fighters of 27 Squadron. The station HQ was destroyed, and fuel dumps set ablaze. The Buffaloes returned from their frustrating chase and met 5 Blenheims of 27 Squadron returning from another mission, and all managed to land at the burning field, picking their way through debris after circling around to find a clear landing path. Again at 10:45 hours, bombers were reported approaching the field from the north, a formation of about 2 dozen Ki-21s at 12,000 feet, or 3,650 meters. 5 Buffaloes were on standby, but again they were ordered not to take off, and the bombers struck the field, leveling the station's barracks, setting more stored fuel aflame. 21 Squadron and the night fighter outfit were each reduced to 4 flyable planes. Sungai Petani was considered unusable, and the remaining flyable planes were ordered that evening to fall back on Butterworth. The remnants of 243 Squadron's detachment at Kota Bharu preceded them there by a few hours. Why the Buffaloes were held on the ground during these raids is unclear, and must have been extraordinarily frustrating, especially as there was clear warning of the attacks in both cases, a luxury that would become less common later on. Realistically, however, their intervention, given that gun failures stymied all attacks on Japanese aircraft so far attempted, was unlikely to have made much difference. The Japanese hit all of the airfields in the north that day, including a raid of 27 bombers on Alor Star that destroyed 9 of the Blenheims there on the ground, more or less wiping out 62 Squadron as an effective unit in a single blow. Later in the day, like Sungai Petani, Alor Star would be considered unsafe and evacuated of all remaining aircraft, which fell back on Butterworth. In these raids were seen 2 Japanese practices which would become commonly seen in this phase of the Malaya Air War. First of these was the 27-plane bomber formation. Second, the bombers used small fragmentation or anti-personnel bombs, rather than the heavier high-explosive weapons normally used by medium bombers. This is because they intended to be in possession of the airfields themselves before long. The smaller bombs wrecked planes and killed men, but hardly damaged the airfield's level surface, so it could be put to use immediately after capture. The situation illustrates how airfields can be a liability to a weaker air force, who is situated too close to the enemy. For now the Allies were compelled to fight to hold the fields, not to use them themselves, which they were no longer capable of doing, but only to deny them to the enemy. This is exactly what was happening at Kota Bharu as well, which by the afternoon was in imminent danger of capture by Japanese infantry, who were fighting their way through the resistance of the Indian troops. 2 Buffaloes remained at Kota Bharu as the enemy closed in, threatening to surround the airfield. Repair work was underway on a third, the one that Flying Officer Holder had flown in the barge strafing attack that morning, which was damaged on landing in the collision with the Hudson. Sergeant Bill Snell, one of the detachment's ground crew, related his experience to 243 Squadron's senior NCO, Flight Sergeant Mothersdale, who wrote this account of the evacuation based on it. Quote, 243 Squadron detachment personnel commenced this repair job and kept it manned all day, work only stopping when we had to take cover during enemy air attacks on the airfield. The remainder of the detachment continued to handle the other 2 serviceable Buffaloes. When we mustered at their aircraft, the beaches barely 2 miles away were under enemy bombardment. We heard the sounds of the infantry battle at the beaches, and it gradually progressed through the bush towards the airfield. As the afternoon progressed, the firing in the bush was coming slowly forward on 2 sides of the airfield. From the airfield it looked like the beginning of an encirclement, and at times stray bullets whistled overhead. When the afternoon was getting on, it got around that the Japs had got through to the airfield. It turned out to be a rumor. Some of us went out further on the airfield and had a look. Firing had come a bit nearer on one side. Soon afterwards, all fly-out aircraft were ordered to be flown out. It was a mad panic. Air crews were running around, and some Hudsons had chocks away before their engines started up. They went off like scalded cats. It was all over in minutes. There were a few stragglers, unserviceable aircraft, including a Blenheim. Its cowls and panels went back on in the fastest time ever, and it was on its way, and it shed 2 of these panels as it went. The 2 serviceable Buffaloes were the last to leave, flown out by Shield and Oliver. Flying Officer Holder remained in the hopes of getting his plane into flying shape, working along with about a dozen ground crew to get the Buffalo in the air. Mothersdale describes their efforts thus, quote, "We realized that the station was being evacuated when we saw some of the buildings had been set on fire. We were feeling tensed and somewhat lonely. It seemed to us that we were the only people around on the airfield. Among us, only Holder and I, meaning Sergeant Snell, had weapons. We each had a .38 caliber revolver. After some time, an officer came and ordered us to leave everything and run for it. He wouldn't even let us set the fuel tank on fire, or even bash some holes in the aircraft. When we left the station, we felt certain that there was no need to have left the aircraft like we did, and thought we could have got the aircraft away. About half an hour and it would have been away. But not everyone left. As the fighting grew nearer and the hard-fighting Indian troops were pushed onto the perimeter of the airfield, they were joined in the battle by many of the remaining ground personnel, covering the evacuation of their comrades in savage close-quarters combat with small arms and grenades, as aircraftman H.G. Edwards, unexpectedly finding himself in action for the first time wielding a Thompson submachine gun, relates, quote, "The Japanese would be in one hole and we in the other. The range was about 20 yards. Very soon all the aircraft which had not got away were burnt masses of twisted metal, and still the Japs came on. He, along with the rest of the defenders, would hold out all night and into the following morning, when heavy rains enabled them to slip away, eventually making their way to Koala Krai by rail. Little was left to be captured here after the fierce battle, but the 2 other fields in Kelantan province, Machang and Gong Kedah, were abandoned without demolitions having been performed. The loss of the airfield was a disaster for the defenders, but the landings here were only a supporting operation for the main blow, which would come across the Siamese border. The Japanese troops landed at Singora and Patani were overcoming the paltry resistance of Siamese constabulary and forming up into 2 groups for the main assault in northern Malaya. Air reinforcements were being flown in from Indo-Chinese airfields, although the unexpectedly poor condition of the Siamese airfields, now in Japanese hands, hampered the efficiency of this move. Finally, elements of the Japanese 143rd Infantry Regiment, which had gone ashore on the Siamese coast of the Kra Isthmus, had pushed across it to Victoria Point in Burmese territory. There was an airfield here, a key staging post on the route from India and the Middle East, and its loss meant that air reinforcements could not fly into Malaya directly, and would have to come by sea. When the battered remnants of the forward-deployed Nor Group squadrons arrived at Butterworth, they found that no provision of food or shelter had been arranged, and the crews of the 6 surviving Buffaloes had to spend the night on the beach, along with the crews of the Blenheims and Hudsons that had fled there, and whatever others had managed to make the trip. The remainder of the personnel left at Kota Bharu eventually made it to Singapore by road or rail, and though Alor Star and Sungai Patani were evacuated of aircraft, ground personnel remained there. The Allied air forces had experienced a shattering first day. 3 of their forward airfields were unusable or in enemy hands, and the planned move into Siam to forestall the invasion was a dead letter. The bombers' early success hitting the invasion fleet had done little to slow down the flow of troops onto the beaches, and the striking force represented by the planes and the northern airfields had been badly weakened and disorganized. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, General Officer Commanding of the ground forces in Malaya, had this to say about the first day, quote, "The rapidity with which the Japanese got their attacks going against our aerodromes was quite remarkable. Practically all the aerodromes in Kelantan, Kedah, Province Wellesley, and Penang were attacked, and in most cases the bombers were escorted by fighters. The performance of Japanese aircraft of all types, and the accuracy of their bombing came as an unpleasant surprise. By evening, our own Air Force had already been seriously weakened. This surprise was largely the result of a serious underestimation of their enemy, and it cost the Allies dear this first day in Malaya. The disasters at the northernmost airfields caused tremendous disruption in the Allied air defense organization. This is hardly surprising, given the well-executed nature of the Japanese assault directed against it and the lack of combat experience of the majority of the Allied air personnel. All the problems of a hasty evacuation were compounded by the fear and uncertainty of knowing things are going badly, but having no reliable information about the larger situation in which one finds oneself caught. This can cause personnel, especially the inexperienced, to fear the sudden onset of the enemy and withdraw from positions, such as Gongkeda and Machang, that were actually not immediately threatened, and to do so without carrying out demolitions or setting booby traps to deny their use to the enemy. Add to this the dislocations caused by rushed evacuations or even outright flight, and it's easy to understand the degree of chaos that had been inflicted on Norgroup. Nor would it have been easy for the higher command back in Singapore to get reliable information about what was happening north of Ipoh. Among the difficulties the commanders faced in trying to retrieve the situation was the telecommunications system that even the highest-ranked personnel were constrained to use. Quote, "Teleprinter lines linked air headquarters with the airfields on the island of Singapore, but not with those on the Malay Peninsula itself, which were connected with headquarters by only 2 telephone lines from northwest Malaya and 1 from northeast and east. These had to be shared with the Army and the civil administration, and they passed through ordinary exchanges. There was no provision for secrecy. On one occasion, the commander-in-chief, in the middle of an important conversation, was informed by the operator that his 3 minutes were up, and he was cut off. This phone network, which was already inadequate in peacetime, was very easily degraded by damaged lines and quickly clogged with traffic, making it almost impossible for Air HQ to put together a good intelligence picture of the situation in the north. For the men on the ground, however, the immediate obvious need was to get what they had left operational to defend themselves as best they could against the renewed attacks that would no doubt be coming their way the next day, if not before. At Butterworth, heroic efforts were being made by those members of 21 Squadron that had withdrawn there to get their 4 remaining fighters ready for action. By 10:40 hours, 2 were ready, and flying officers Jeff Shepard and Daryl Spruill took off, climbing out to rendezvous with a force of Blenheims and fly escort for them to hit the Japanese concentration at Singora. The bombers, however, failed to appear, and after it was clear that the Blenheims were going to be delayed for a few hours, the 2 Buffalo pilots flew northward to scout in the direction of Ban Sadao. South of there, they found a column of Japanese troops, including a dozen tanks, advancing into Malaya. They descended into attack positions and strafed the enemy armor, prompting a Japanese soldier to run into the open waving a rising sun flag, either in defiance or, more likely, because he thought the Buffaloes were Japanese planes. In any case, he thought better of it as they came around for another pass and went back into cover. In this case, the Buffalo's guns gave them no trouble. The other pair of fighters was ready to fly in the afternoon. At 15:30 hours, this pair, with Flying Officer Dick McKenney and Flight Lieutenant Fred Williams in the cockpits, took off and flew patrol over the airfield, while the bomber force for the delayed Singora raid was readied. After some time aloft, they were engaged by Japanese fighters. The other 2 Buffaloes, Flying Officers Montefiore and Flight Lieutenant Max White at the controls, took off to join them. William recounts the engagement like this, quote, "We were jumped by a horde of Zeros and the shooting began both ways. The weather and the static were so severe that our radios were only working after a fashion. The grease on the bullets of my .5s firing through the air screw had vaporized, came back over the windshield. It made it almost impossible for me to see ahead. I fastened onto one aircraft that I thought was a Zero and fired a short burst, and I nearly shot down McKenney. We had taken off together and were furiously engaged, murderously outnumbered, and fighting as much to save our own lives as to shoot down anyone else. Hey Fred, lay off, it's me, Dick." Thank heaven the radio had worked for once. It was all a mix-up. There were so many. We were firing blindly and trying to get away. At last we did break off, and Dick and I got back to the airdrome at Butterworth. We were practically out of fuel on landing after more than an hour and a half in the air, so we landed. It was 5 p.m. White and Montefiore were still flying. 2 formations of Japs had just gone over the airfield before we arrived and had bombed and strafed it, and we knew we had to hit back at them. There was a petrol tanker near the strip. McKenney and I went straight over to get fuel from it, but found that some conscientious person in awe of Air Force orders had padlocked the hoses. Everyone was in the slit trenches, but who on earth had the key? We were stymied. But we could see the Japs coming back, 27 bombers and 27 fighters in formation. Without wasting any more time or thought on fuel, we took off again and climbed for the formation on rated power. Dick and I had little way of knowing how much fuel we had, but were in no doubt that, on flying time alone, it was precious little. The best we knew was that our tanks were self-sealing, so even if they'd been holed, they would not have leaked, but our fuel gauges were still useless. There was no way of being sure just how we stood. The Jap formation flew on as we climbed. It took no notice of Penang's pitiful anti-aircraft guns until 2 bombers began to trail smoke. Then the bombers unloaded on Butterworth again. By that time we were in the scrap, mixed up with them over the airstrip. After the bomb run, at least 3 Zeros peeled off and came at us, the leader firing at Dick. They separated us. Dick went to the left and I went to the right, and that was when he was shot down. Things were pretty desperate. Dick fired back whenever he could latch on, but he was hit, and his aircraft burst into flames. He parachuted and went down into the sea between Butterworth and Penang. I got locked in with about 3 Zeros, and my guns jammed. I had no choice but to dive away for the airfield, but as I did, I drew the Zeros with me through the anti-aircraft fire. They forced me to dive at such speed that I came in fast for my first approach to the strip. Buffalo was so far along the runway and still too fast that I had to go around again. On the second approach, my engine coughed and died, out of petrol, as I was coming in. I made a dead stick landing, flung myself out of my cockpit onto the strip, and scrambled into a bunker. They followed me down, and they swept the strip with machine gun fire and got my aircraft, blew it up on the runway. Dick and I had lost our Buffaloes, and Dick was somewhere in the sea. McKenney was in fact rescued by an elderly English naval officer in a launch, who found him holding on to a Malay fish trap in the sea between the island and the airfield, badly burned about the face but otherwise unhurt. The other pair of Buffaloes didn't fare much better. Flying Officer Montefiore was engaged by 6 or more enemy fighters, probably Key 43s, again misidentified as A6M Zeros, and was forced to bail out of his bullet-riddled aircraft after a fierce dogfight, which he claimed to have downed one of his assailants. While floating down in his parachute, he witnessed McKenney bailing out of his burning fighter, and Williams tangling with the 3 Japanese fighters and diving for the airfield. He landed safely and returned to Butterworth that evening on a bicycle. White's plane was shot up as well, and he made a forced landing on Penang, from which he emerged uninjured, and with his parachute pack slung over his shoulder, walked to the ferry and crossed back to Butterworth, also arriving that evening. During the raid, a pair of Blenheims assigned to the raid on Singora mentioned earlier took off and tried to get clear of the raid. One of these was immediately forced back down by Japanese fighters. The other, however, flown by a squadron leader Arthur Scarf, got away and carried out the raid on Singora unescorted and alone. After bombs away, his plane was bounced by Japanese fighters, which damaged the bomber and wounded Scarf himself very badly. He nevertheless evaded the fighters and brought his plane and its crew back to Alor Star, where he successfully belly-landed the stricken Blenheim. His crew survived, but Scarf succumbed to his wounds and died soon after. For his audacity and his courage, he was posthumously decorated with the Victoria Cross. In the confusion immediately after the bombing, a Dragon Rapide, a commandeered 2-engine biplane passenger aircraft used by the Malaya Volunteer Air Force for its supply flights, started its takeoff run just as Flight Lieutenant Williams was bringing his powerless Buffalo in for a dead stick landing. The fighter came down right in front of the Rapide, and with a display of considerable skill, the pilot pulled the big plane up over the Buffalo, only to be attacked by a twin-engine aircraft, thought by the pilot to be a Blenheim, which knocked out one of his engines and shattered some of his instruments. This is possible, but it seems more likely that he caught a burst from one of Williams' pursuers. But in any case, the MVAF pilot pressed on, nursed his damaged plane back to Ipoh, harassed by enemy fighters on the way. The pursuit was witnessed by Sergeant Wareham, flying overhead in one of the converted photo reconnaissance Buffaloes. Despite the fact that this variant of the fighter was unarmed, Wareham went to the aid of the endangered aircraft, as he recounts here. Quote, I was coming back from a reconnaissance flight to Singora, and I was due to refuel at Ipoh. Strangely, civilian aircraft were still flying, and I arrived to find a Rapide, which was carrying civilian passengers, being shot at by several Zeros. They saw me coming, and 1 or 2 started to chase me. I had nothing in the way of guns, so I couldn't do any fighting. But I knew the terrain very well, and Ipoh had some very funny places with some very narrow ravines. One bloke was following me very closely, and I went down between 2 very small hills. He followed me, but he went into one. I was credited with that plane. Both Wareham and the Rapide landed safely at Ipoh. On the outward leg of his reconnaissance, Wareham had stopped at Butterworth to drop off new solenoids for the Buffalo's guns, in an attempt to make 6 unserviceable fighters there combat ready. This work was barely begun when all remaining aircraft at the ruined airfield were ordered to leave for Ipoh. The remnants of 21 Squadron, along with the 6 remaining airworthy Blenheims, arrived there soon afterwards. They found a confused situation there, with again no provisions made for the influx of evacuated personnel, who continued to stream in from the north throughout the night. Worse, the airstrip had been a rear area facility, with no early warning system or defenses of any kind, and only a skeleton staff. Getting the field ready for combat operations fell to the men of 21 Squadron, who were hindered in this task by the lack of effective command and the low morale among the Allied personnel, fostered by a fear-ridden atmosphere, spurred on by alarming rumors and by the fact that the situation was visibly out of control. The Allies would be granted a respite, of a kind at least, for the next day. The 10th saw a pause in the activity of the Japanese Army Air Force, who had achieved their objective of gaining air supremacy over the northern border, where the main striking force of 25th Army was just beginning to advance on the defenses guarding the western trunk road. However, the British would be dealt a very heavy blow this day by another aerial threat, the expert aviators of the Japanese Navy. The battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, along with 4 destroyers, left Singapore Harbor and put to sea at 17:35 hours on the 8th, the uncertain situation following the Kota Bharu landings. This naval squadron, now designated Force Z, was small but still quite threatening to the Japanese, who had no ships of comparable power any closer than southern Indochina, where the battleship Haruna and the battlecruiser Congo were held as distant cover for the invasion force. Admiral Phillips' intention was to proceed quickly northwards to Singora and attack the concentration of Japanese shipping there before these ships could intervene. He had requested from Air HQ at Singapore reconnaissance and fighter cover at Singora, which he expected to be in a position to attack at dawn on the 10th. The requested reconnaissance flights were promised, but the Admiral was informed that fighter cover could not be provided over Singora at dawn on the 10th. This latter part of the message was poorly worded, and understood to mean that Force Z could expect no fighter cover at all, not just at the time and place specified. This misunderstanding would have potentially deadly consequences. But initially, fortune seemed to favor this risky enterprise. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft over Singapore on the morning of the 9th mistook 2 large cargo ships for the 2 capital ships, and reported that they were still in harbor. This mistake was corrected by a Japanese submarine about midday, which reported that the ships had left Singapore harbor. Aircraft were then sent out to find Force Z, but the weather provided concealment, and none made contact, until a float plane found the ships at 17:30 hours, some distance north of Kota Bharu. The appearance of another pair of float planes indicated that surprise was lost, and prompted Admiral Phillips to abandon the Singora raid, head back towards Singapore at 21:30 hours. En route, he received a report of landings at Kuantan. This was not far from his present course, so he decided to head there instead to pounce on the reported landing force. No landing was taking place there, however, and the change in course meant that daylight found Force Z still some ways from Singapore. It was soon found and tracked by a Japanese submarine. Then at 10:15 hours on the 10th, a naval float plane spotted the British vessels. At precisely 11:13 hours, the first Navy bombers and torpedo planes arrived. Phillips did not call Singapore for air cover, or to report himself under attack. It has been suggested that this was to preserve radio silence, which is hard to believe since the attack meant that the point of radio silence, which was to avoid detection, was obviously beyond saving. Others point out that the misunderstanding about the availability of fighter cover may have convinced the Admiral that there was little point in calling, as none would be available anyway. Others again note that Phillips had gained a reputation amongst his peers and subordinates for his belief that aircraft posed little threat to capital ships, though I imagine this opinion, however strongly held, may have changed after the engagement began. Whatever the reason may have been, Admiral Phillips made no calls for help. But in fact, the ships were well within the range of the Buffalo squadrons at Singapore. However, no one there knew of the ship's plight until 11:58 hours, a full 45 minutes after the Japanese air assault had begun, when the captain of the Repulse, on his own initiative, radioed Singapore for aid. It was in vain, for both the ships had less than a half an hour left. In response to the Repulse's signal, 2 Buffaloes of 243 Squadron, based at Kelang, took off immediately, followed closely by 10 from 453 Squadron, and a photo reconnaissance Buffalo from No. 4 Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. 488 Squadron would also send some of their fighters off in pairs. The first to arrive at the scene of the battle was Flight Lieutenant Mowbray Garden, 243 Squadron, who describes the mission like this, quote, "I received a signal from Ops on the telephone to scramble my flight, take off in pairs at intervals of 20 minutes, fly on a bearing of 10 degrees from Kelang, to take us into the China Sea. I did not know what to expect, but I had been told on the telephone that I had to look after an important ship which was being bombed. There was a certain amount of mist, but quite quickly I noticed the sea had not only traces of oil, but increasingly was one mass of oil, and then I saw it. one large battleship floating helplessly in the choppy sea, without steerage and listing badly on one side. With its 4 gun turrets, it could only have been one ship, the Prince of Wales, and she was sinking. All around her the sea, as far as the eye could see, was oil, and men were jumping off the ship into the oil, some with and some without pieces of debris like chairs and planks with which to support themselves when in the oily sea. There were a few small Navy ships of one kind or another standing by trying to help. On my approach, the remaining workable anti-aircraft guns of the Prince of Wales opened fire on me, which is hardly surprising, but I was able to release the colors of the day through the very pistol, and the firing stopped. There was nothing I could do except to patrol the area in case of a fresh Japanese attack, and wait for my second section of Buffaloes to relieve me. Sergeant Greg Board of 453 Squadron arrived shortly afterwards, and had a very different impression of what he saw in the sea below. Quote, "A giant warship with its long carved wake still showing was rolling over on its side. I had never seen such a huge battle wagon before. The ship kept rolling over while it was still moving, and I saw hundreds of men scrambling frantically up along the keel. We cheered wildly at the sight of the Japanese battleship as it began to go down and circled, watching in suspense as the bow of the huge vessel began to go lower and lower. Then the stern lifted high into the air, the propellers glistening briefly, and the monster plunged to the bottom. I saw another part of the sea filled with wreckage and the forms of men in the water. Without any Japanese airplanes in the air, we turned and headed back. We had no radios, but waved happily to each other. That must have been one hell of a fight, with the Japanese taking it right where it hurt the most." Board and his fellow pilots landed at Semboang, and were excitedly pouring drinks to toast the naval victory, when an intelligence officer brought the celebration to an abrupt halt by informing them of which ship it actually was that they had seen sinking. The loss of Force Z was another crushing blow to Allied morale, amplified many times by its coming on the heels of the punishment meted out to Nor Group in the preceding 2 days. The prospects of the Allied position in Malaya, which were hardly rosy before, were exceedingly dark as the 10th drew to a close. In reality, though, the Japanese drive on Singapore had barely begun. And that is where I will end this video. Next time we'll look at the next phase of the air war over the Malay Peninsula, as the Japanese main forces under Yamashita pour across the border and the shattered Allies scramble to contest the growing Japanese air supremacy. The Malayan campaign really shows what the Imperial Japanese Army could achieve when operating at the top of its form, as a quick and nimble instrument which compensated for its comparative lack of heavy artillery and armor with creative and aggressive tactics, kept its foes off balance, too busy reacting to Japanese moves to formulate an effective response. The aerial blitzkrieg, which all but annihilated the Allied Air Force in the critical area of the border, is one example of this. In any case, the Allies had a grim reality to deal with, as we'll soon see. So, until next time, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.